Lovely to see so many people joining us today. We'll just give a moment or two for people all to be admitted. A really warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today. I'm really pleased to see so many of you here. I'm pleased to be talking today about the role of a trustee in times of change and uncertainty. And I'm sure we can all agree that that is a really very topical subject at the moment. I'm Marjorie Infield. I'm a senior consultant at MPC, and I'm joined by three fantastic speakers today who will each be sharing their own perspectives on that subject. We'll be hearing from each of them in turn, and then after each of them has spoken, there'll be time for you to ask questions, and hopefully we'll also get some discussion going between all three speakers. So before we get started, just a really small bit of housekeeping. This is a free public webinar. It's open to everyone and there may be journalists present. We'll be recording the session, including any questions that you ask at the end, and it will be available to watch online afterwards, both by you and anyone else who would like to see it. If you tweet, we encourage you to use the hashtag NPC trusteeship, which you can see at the bottom of this page here, so that other people can join in the conversation too. Please do ask questions as we go through. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll be collating these and asking as many as possible in the second half of the session after the panelists have shared their initial thoughts. We're really grateful to the Clothworkers Company who've made this webinar possible and made it possible to put on the event for free. They've been supporting these trusteeship seminars for many years, and we're really grateful for that. So that's all the housekeeping you'll be pleased to hear. Before I invite our speakers onto the floor, I am going to very briefly set the scene. It's obvious that there's been lots of change and uncertainty in recent years, from delivering services during the unprecedented health crisis that we've all been through, to navigating the challenges created by the cost of living crisis. Of course, that's the crisis that's on our minds right now. We're at the beginning of winter. Charities are already seeing a rise in demand for their services as more people face financial hardship and fall into poverty. And those same factors that make life harder for people also constrain the charities, us, that exist to help them. A rise in the cost of food, energy and staff is a really big problem if your organisation feeds people, houses people, or has staff that deliver services. But that's not the only crisis of recent times. COVID lockdowns throughout 2020 and 2021 fundamentally changed the way that many organisations, including charities, had to deliver their services. It's also had a significant negative effect on many organisations' income streams as community fundraising was impacted and trading income fell for many people. And of course, for some organisations, climate change and its associated impacts are an environmental crisis unfolding in real time that has a real impact on the work that they are doing too. So we're living in a time of profound challenge when organisations need to be able to cope with significant external shocks. But in reacting to crises and other challenges, it can be difficult for trustees to determine when to get involved. The line between executive and board roles may be well defined in business as usual times, but it can become blurred when the unexpected happens. And that can be especially challenging for charity trustees who are usually providing their time for free and are capacity constrained. So how is the role of a trustee different in times of crisis, change and uncertainty? And what stays the same? What's the role of a trustee in governing charities so that they can continue to be impactful in the face of change and uncertainty? Those are the questions that we're going to explore today. So I'm going to turn to our first speaker, Nigel Kippax. Nigel is the chair of trustees at the Hearts Disability Sports Foundation, a charity which promotes the development of disability sport in Hertfordshire. In his professional life, he's partnerships director at Getting On Board, which supports people to become charity trustees, particularly those people who are currently underrepresented on trustee boards. And prior to his move into the charity sector, Nigel worked in the corporate sector for over 30 years, specialising in organisational effectiveness. So he has a wealth of expertise to share with us today. So Nigel, over to you.
Marjorie, that's very kind of you. And thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, 30 years in corporate sector. Hopefully that was 30 years experience, not 1 year of experience times 30 times over. So hopefully I've learned something over the years. Just to try and answer that question, what's the role of the trustee in times of change and uncertainty? Yes, as by way of an introduction, just to say, these are my thoughts based on experience. I'm not saying they're right. You might have different views and so on, but hopefully what I'm saying stimulates some discussion and questioning, and helps us all to talk about it and learn something. So that's the purpose of today. I think, as Marjorie said, there's been a lot of challenge in the last 3 years through COVID, inflation, and so on and so on. I think, again, by way of an introduction, I'd say these are major external changes over which we have no control. Particularly COVID has been a huge one. They are changes, external changes, over which we have no control, but they're not the first ones, and they certainly won't be the last ones. I think particularly with COVID, I think what I saw at the beginning of the crisis of COVID, it was the reaction of different charities to this external crisis, again, over which we had no control. It was the reaction that polarized charities, and in our own charity, there were decisions we took, which are hopefully, I think most of them were the right decisions in changing what we did and the spending of money and so on. But within the charity sector, there were also, unfortunately, in my view, a lot of charities who buttoned down the hatches and tried to protect things. And I think that throws up, for me, the issue of, in a time of crisis, in a time of external change, how do we react? And the trustee role on the board of trustees, for me, is about making decisions. If the board aren't making decisions, I'd say, well, why are they there? So then the question for me becomes, how do we make decisions in times of change and uncertainty? And that's really what I'm going to focus on, is how we go about making the decisions. And we can look at the types of the decisions, the basis for those decisions, and look at the process for decision making, and one or two other things that hopefully will stimulate some discussion. So I'm going to do it under 6 headings, which is strange for me. I normally focus on 3 bullet points, so let's regard it as 2 times 3 bullet points. The first thing I'd like to highlight in terms of decision making is the type of decision. And I want to distinguish between management decisions and leadership decisions. And I'm not the broader what is management versus leadership, but in terms of decisions. And the distinction I'm making here is that a management decision for me is one that you can follow protocol. There is a right way to do things. You are seeking the right way to do things. You're seeking the right answer. So, for example, with trustees, there is a role description. It tells you what to do. Follow it, and you will maybe get the right answer. The other type of decision, a leadership decision for me, is where there isn't a single right answer. The decision, whatever decision you take, is a judgment call. Whatever decision you take as a trustee or a board of trustees, there's going to be trade-offs. You can't have totally A, you can't have totally B. It's something in the middle. Whatever you choose, somebody is not going to be happy. And I think that's that type of decision. For me, I term those as leadership decisions, where there are trade-offs, you're not following management protocol. And for me, leadership in a charity board and the decisions of a charity board are 80% leadership decisions and 20% management decisions. I think there is a pitfall that some charity trustees fall into, whereby if I follow the rules, I will do everything that's required. I don't agree with that. And the next thing, so that was a kind of type of decision. The next heading I had was the basis for decisions. And, I think let's not beat about the bush. Charities exist for their beneficiaries. End of. No exceptions. So all decisions must be made in the interest of beneficiaries and the charity's purpose. And I think when with my own charity, our own charity, when we went into COVID, for example, I feel we took decisions based purely on what's best for the beneficiaries. So, for example, we were running daycares with around sports. When COVID hit, unsurprisingly, the need for support didn't go away, and yet there were several daycare centres who closed their doors and said, "Come back after COVID." We moved online. We moved online within 48 hours, and we tried to do the best we could in that time, because we focused, I believe, on the needs of the beneficiaries. And in this, I would challenge. Many of you will have read the Charity Commission CC3. Charity Commission CC3 says that all trustees should act in the best interests of the charity. I don't like that at all, actually. I think that's wrong. I think it gets misinterpreted. It gets misinterpreted as protecting the brand, the name, and the history of the charity, and that's not what it's about. And I think, I think if it said the charity's purpose or the charity's beneficiaries, I'd be much more akin to accept that. And of course, if you are focusing on the charity as a name and a brand, you're probably less likely to be open to collaboration and mergers and with other charities, for example. So there's the types of charities, the basis for the charities. I think the other thing about decisions by the board, to be successful as a charity, and you can define your own way of you need to decide on your own definition of what success means, but it needs a balance of control and creativity. You can't just focus on control and compliance and expect to grow and grow the impact with beneficiaries. Creativity requires change. Change requires trustees, and this comes to another of the points around the role of the trustee. Change requires trustees to take risks. So avoiding risks and mitigating risks and moving and so that really isn't good enough. We need to be prepared to take risks, focused on the beneficiaries. The next point I wanted to make was around trustee process. Good decisions require the voice of the beneficiary. So I'd ask, where is that voice of the beneficiary in the boardroom? Good decisions require diversity to understand the data and consider the options. And finally, charity board decisions are collective. So we must have full engagement with all the trustees. And if you want full engagement, then the issues of board dynamics are critical and often overlooked. If we could look at a typical board agenda, if we had a little bit more time, and far too often, the board agenda jumps into the tasks and doesn't actually address the people issues, particularly the inclusion issues in each meeting. How do we feel? Are we actually there? And if people aren't engaged, they don't contribute to the decisions, you won't make the best decisions. The fifth area around risk, I touched on this, but if you're growing impact, you are changing, you are taking risks. And we're working with the Charity Finance Group at the moment, building on some work that was done by Robert Kaplan at Harvard Business School that was done for corporate America. We're tailoring it for the charity sector, which looks at risk guidance in 3 categories. Only one of those requires mitigation and avoidance. I think as an example of this, I think going back to how we responded at COVID, several charities I observed were very keen to protect their reserves, their financial reserves, during the COVID crisis. Frankly, I just don't understand this. Why on earth have you built up financial reserves if you're not prepared to use them up in a major crisis? You know, why do you have reserves? And the only thing I can think of is that you're focusing on protecting the charity, not focused on beneficiaries. And the final point about decision making is as a trustee, you are there for a limited time, probably 3 years, maybe a little bit longer, maybe 6 years. But I would pose every trustee a question that what are you aiming to hand back? Because you are going to hand it back. Are you going to hand back a safe charity or a better charity? And so I think those are 6 areas to consider around decision making. And I think within times of change and uncertainty, it's those decisions. It's that when we're under stress, we revert to type. And it's when the pressure is on from outside that we really start to see the true culture and ethos and what's really important for trustees. So I think just to highlight 3 takeaways for me: role of the trustees, 80% leadership decisions. The board dynamics and diversity are critical in decision making. We must make time to address the people and inclusion issues rather than jumping into tasks. And the third point is the boards for me are all about making decisions to grow impact. And as a final point, there's always change and uncertainty. That is the role of making leadership decisions, because you are looking for change in areas of uncertainty. That's the role. And to be brutal, if you don't feel comfortable, you don't feel you can work in that environment, then maybe you need to hand it over to somebody else. But that's just a personal opinion. The changes may have been particular over the last few years, but that's the role of the trustee. There we go. That's my little bit.
For thought there. Just as a reminder to everyone listening in, do start using the Q&A function to add any questions that you want us to discuss later with Nigel. Nigel, before we move on to the next speaker, I wonder if I can just use Chair's prerogative to ask you a question or two. You mentioned at the end there that trustees are there for a limited time, and kind of posing that question of what are you aiming to hand back? Yep. I wonder whether you think there is ever justification for battening down the hatches on charity during a period of crisis, if the trustees believe that you really can't carry on delivering through the crisis and be there afterwards to support beneficiaries.
Well, it's a judgment call, isn't it? What is the best for the beneficiaries? And if your beneficiaries are facing a greater challenge now, then if you're going to back away, well, who's going to fill that gap? So what are you doing to work with other charities, with other providers to fill that gap? And I don't think it is acceptable for a charity that is set up to support beneficiaries just to say, oh, sorry, I can't do that anymore, unless you're going to close the charity. In which case, hand over the assets, give it to somebody else who can do it. Brutally. We don't, you know, the charities don't have a God-given right to exist. They need to do the work for the beneficiaries. If they're not supporting beneficiaries, then maybe they shouldn't be there.
Yeah, wonderful. So that's kind of a guiding North Star through your decision making when you're in crisis. So. What's best for the beneficiaries?
It goes back to the role of the trustee of ensuring that charity fulfills its purpose and its objects. Well, what did the charity tell the charity mission it was going to do? Yeah. And if you're not doing it, then you shouldn't be there.
Fantastic. Thank you. We'll leave it there for the moment, but I'm sure that people will come back with lots of questions towards the end of the session. So we'll move on to our second speaker now, who is Adebayo Oyeniyi. Adebayo is the Chair of Trustees at the Vadis Trust, which provides social housing, care and support for people in South East London living with mental health needs. He's chaired the board there for 4 years and recently oversaw its impressive COVID-19 response, for which it was shortlisted at the Charity Governance Award in the COVID-19 response category. Beyond the Vadis Trust, Adebayo is Head of Operations at Advance UK, where he works to ensure people with a disability or mental health condition are provided with quality housing and support He has over 20 years experience in the housing, health and social sectors. So Adebayo, really looking forward to hearing about your experience at the Quo Vadis Trust through COVID.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. And I also want to thank Nigel for that well said presentation. Now you've got my slide there. So I will focus on our response to the pandemic and use that as an example. And I think Nigel really nailed it when he talked about decision making as a key role of trustees. And I want to start by saying that, as we all know, change is constant, and it's more challenging. Change is more challenging in times of crisis and uncertainty. And as trustees, we must embrace change. We cannot afford to sit back. Just touching on the question that was put to Nigel, that we have to embrace and respond, to change. So how we responded during COVID, I want to look at a simple and practical framework which I have adopted from a gentleman called Stephen Cohill, who is also a trustee, who spoke. I think he did a write-up on how to respond in time of crisis at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, because it was quite an uncertain time, unprecedented challenge, which everyone didn't know how to respond. So can you move to the next slide, please? Oh yes, you've said a lot about a little bit about about Quo Vadis Trust. So we are Quo Vadis Trustees, social housing care and support for people in Southeast London living with mental health needs. Is just to give a little synopsis of that organization where I chair the board of trustees. So it's a small organization, supporting 200 clients, work in 6 London boroughs, and employ 60 staff members, and it was established in 1990. Let's move to the next, please. Right, so I mentioned about the framework before I go into the real example that I mentioned at the start of my talk. So I want to concentrate on these, what I call the 5 Ps. The first one is purpose of charity. So, because as I said, in times of uncertainty, there is anxiety, and it's easily to be distracted. And like Nigel mentioned as well, we have to ensure we focus on the purpose of the charity, the purpose for the beneficiaries. However, in doing this, we have to be willing to identify opportunities in order to gain competitive advantage and greater resilience, especially in time of crisis. There's always opportunities in challenging times, and times of change that charities can thrive on without deviating from its primary purpose. I mean, when I talk about the example of how we responded then, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then the second P is perspective as trustees. So we have to focus on asking the tough questions and the right questions, so that we ensure we do our due diligence to ensure reasonable care, caution, and proper action is taken, that the situation that we are in, we ensure we avoid risk as much as we can. This is because financial and reputational risk is higher at times of crisis and uncertainty. But like I said in the first one, that doesn't mean that we should now fold our hands and do nothing. But by asking these questions, it helps us to make the right decisions, in this time. Then this third P is practicality. So we don't want to also get too bogged down, with theory. because at that time, you want to ensure you can respond swiftly. You know, you want to be agile as a trustee. So we keep it practical and focused on delivery, and we steer people's mindsets, you know, to this, that we want to be able to deliver, we want to be able to respond on time. So we'll bring a sense of practicality to discussion and decision making, and not make matters more complicated than it already is. Then the fourth one is positivity. As a trustee, because the trustees play a leadership role, as the board in total, they play a leadership role for the organization. And we know in times of crisis and in time of uncertainty, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of negativity all out there already. So as a trustee and as a board, we want to be a force for that, for the positivity. So it's important for us as trustees to bring a sense of this in tackling uncertainty. Then the last one, which is just to give it, is I've titled we've titled that pounds, you know, which is the financial matters, because this usually is one that trustees dislike or in dealing with, or but pounds, I mean, as in the finance, it's a make or break for charities. And as a trustee, we want to ensure that, you know, we want to continue to be relevant and to still be able to do the work we are set up to do, you know, for our beneficiaries. Can you please move to the next slide, please? Right, so now coming to how QVT responded. So I'll just give the situation then. The night shelters across London were closing down because it came to light that the way it was operating posed very high risk for homeless people, you know, and there's a high risk of people dying with the existing model, which is a generic support hub model of, you know, people coming at 8 p.m. and so they have beds in one place where there's a lot of people. So there's no way that would work. You know, it's definitely, that would have led to a lot of people dying because there is a high risk of transmission. So the local council approached the executives of QVT to pilot a rough sleepers initiative. And you would see that I did mention that we, as an organization, our key client group were people with enduring mental health. So this was brought to the board, but we know that part of the main purpose of the organization is to help people with mental health needs. And statistics shows that people that are rough sleepers, they, majority of them, I think there's a statistic that actually says that about 53% of them suffer from enduring mental health. So with this, we can see that we can still respond to the need of the time. It was a time of uncertainty where there is a need there. So as a board of trustee, we were, you know, quite happy to respond to this, you know, to this need. Please go to the next slide. So we responded in an agile and flexible manner. We, of course, did our due diligence, you know, ensuring that risk is minimized, how we're going to respond to ensure that the problem we're trying to avoid of people dying, we are not creating that same problem, but we are part of the solution, not the problem. And it was successful. We saw, I mean, the executive had to make their case, you know, through the due diligence, and we supported it. And due to that, over 130 rough sleepers safely went through the rough sleeper initiative project during the pandemic. And in view of that, QVT now is contracted for a 5-year block contract, to continue to deliver the RSI projects. Let's go to the next slide. So you would see from this example that, I did mention that, you concentrate on the purpose of the organization. And one of the strategic plan even before the pandemic was we had intention of diversification. So that opportunity arose, and we took it on board. And also so that I talked about the financial matter. We had to, after doing our due diligence, we responded, and by responding, these are actually in a positive way added to the organization's income. So additional stream of income for the organization. Then continuity of sustainability for funding from local authority, because of how they were impressed on how QVT responded. Then it also created, opportunity for the organization to further their work in the community. The local authority have also offered for the organization to consider a young people's cohort, which is something else that QVT is looking into. And in view of all of that, so series of awards was presented to QVT. Won the governance award 2020 for 2022, then the regional winner for employer of the year 2021, because during that time we actually, the way we responded, we did not follow any of the staff. Whatever money that QVT made was put back to ensure that the staff are well taken care of, ensuring that they were able to respond effectively. Then also another award was the trusted charity level 2. We moved on to that in that same year, 2021. Then also QVT also got the award of Great Place to Work for 2022. So why I've listed all these is just to show that there's always opportunity in time of crisis. There's opportunities to respond effectively and decisively. And as we know, the crisis is not ended yet. So we can, as Board of Trustees, make effective decisions, as Nigel has mentioned in his presentation, and also see the outcome of that in the impact we have, the positive impact we have in our community and the society. Thank you.
Good to hear about your experience at QVT, and great to have that encouragement that there are always opportunities in every crisis. So not to be feel overwhelmed by the crisis that you don't see those opportunities too. I wonder whether I can ask, just before we move on to our final speaker, about what the board has learned from that experience. Is there anything that you would do differently if you had your time again in responding to the COVID pandemic?
The only thing I would say, that what would we do differently? Like I did say, that it's in time of crisis, Charlie, when like the pandemic, which we've never experienced that before. It took us a while. In order to make that decision, which I think I would say it was worth it, but again, I would want to do that again to ensure that I take everybody along as the chair, because a lot of people were quite apprehensive, thinking about the fact that, well, the reason why why they were closing the night shelter was because we're trying to avoid people dying. So taking on that responsibility seems a huge one. And so the only thing I would want to do again is to create that sense of confidence and purpose for the trustee as a chair, to encourage people that we should not shy away from challenges. But when we look well and we really question ourselves well, something positive can come out of it, and which is what happened in this case.
Bringing
Yes,
the whole board along on that journey.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Adebayo.
Thank you.
We'll move on now to our final speaker for today, who is Monica Waller. Monica is a trustee at Richmond Borough Mind, which offers information, advice and support to people in that borough who experience mental health challenges. She is also a trustee at Unfold, which was previously called Westminster Befriend a Family, which offers mentoring and supports families and young people in Westminster to achieve new goals in life. Monica is particularly interested in improving board effectiveness and embedding lived experience in governance and decision-making on boards. In her professional life, Monica has worked for over 17 years in HR for a variety of large corporations. Monica, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I want to say also big thank you to Nigel and Adebayo for lots of words of wisdom and for sharing so generously lessons learned. So maybe just to change the pace a little bit, I would like to talk about the future, and I can make you a promise. I'm going to under-deliver on the topic of the future of the trusteeship. I don't have a crystal ball. All I can tell you is my personal experience by being a trustee of 4 years at Richmond Borough Mind and about 4 months at Unfold. So I would like to continue with the presentation and talk to you about lived experience on the board and behavioral governance. If I could have the next slide, please. This was my first trusteeship, actually still is my first trusteeship. And I was curious how to make the board future-proof, because as Nigel has already pointed out, often we are there as trustees for 3 years, if we're lucky, maybe for 6 years. If we're really, really lucky, if the governing document allows, we are allowed to stay a little bit longer, maybe 9 years. Why I became a trustee at a mental health charity? Because I have lived experience of mental health issues. And I thought that it's really important to talk to people who perhaps have never been CEOs, CFOs, had big leadership positions, that lived experience on the boards is something that matters more and more and more. If I could have the next slide, please. Why does it matter? Basically, us as experts by experience, whether you have a non-visible disability or whether you have another health challenge, we provide unique perspective for the board. We try to keep the alignment to the charity's purpose as well, and lived experience of trustees or potential trustees is also important when it comes to trustee recruitment. It really gives you the a chance to access wider talent pool of potential trustees. So if you start looking at people who have contributed in the community, perhaps not in large corporations, leaders who are people with everyday experience like myself. I'm an average HR consultant, but I bring to the table my personal experience. I do think that, as Nigel said, I could be the voice of beneficiary in the room. So lived experience on the boards will matter more and more. I think it's also good for the diversity of the board. It really enhances the reputation of a charity. If I could have the next slide, please. As somebody with lived experience and being a new trustee, I was super curious about what am I supposed to do and how am I supposed to behave on the board. It's not your average team meeting. So that's why I decided to take on a few courses. One of them was with the Chartered Governance Institute. and I learned about behavioral governance. So I found out that it's really important for boards to be self-reflective and empower trustees to develop and grow in their role. So it is super important that we behave and operate as a collective. It's not just one trustee versus another one. We really need to figure out how we all work together. And in the best fashion, the good boardroom behavior will include appropriate use of knowledge, skills, and experience. So it's not just one person talking all the time. You do actually listen to people who have experience or particular knowledge in on the topic. I'm also quite passionate about independent thinking, so I do my own research. I also try to figure out what's going on in a wider sector, third sector, the charity sector. And I try to figure out how to work well with the CEO. So I would like to talk to you. I would like to encourage you to look up a constructive challenge, to know when it's the right time to praise the CEO and when is the right time to perhaps challenge them and stretch them a little bit. If I could have the next slide, please. So when we come to think about behavior, as Nigel said already, one of the things we can spot clearly what habits and biases we might come across is our boardroom agenda. So often we are more excited about operational or urgent matters, but sometimes we also have a natural preference to talk more about strategy or finance. So typically, we would talk about those big and well researched subjects. But what about other slightly more new additions like innovation, impact, staff well-being? How often do we talk about that in our boardroom? How often do we put those big ticket items on the agenda? If I could have the next slide, please. So let's start thinking about the future. So let's start bursting our familiarity bubble. Let's start going outside our comfort zone. To be honest, on the day, sometimes when the life gets really, really busy, your mindset is anything but progressive. So be mindful when you start acting a bit more insular. Be mindful when you are less willing to go beyond assumptions and do become mindful manager. So try to think of traditional social norms and how they constrain you in your thinking and your decision making in your contributions on the board, and try ideally becoming the mindful mover. So be as proactive as you can be. Try to reshape the traditional thinking, group thinking on the board. Try to figure out how to align values with those larger objectives. And I'm sure that you all know certain characters on the board who perhaps fall in one of those 4 categories. If I could have the next slide, please. So what happens if we get the behavioral governance right? There are really big benefits to your charity. First of all, you will enhance charitable outcomes, so you will really deliver for the beneficiaries. You will improve quality of decision making, and you will also continuously learn and be relevant. So your charity will never have the mission drift or perhaps less frequently. And really, most importantly, you will become a better trustee. So you'll fulfill your role to the fullest. And the change starts with you. So I've given you quite a bit of theory. So if I could have the next slide, I would like to talk to you about what happened in those 2 charities I'm a member of or on the board of. So Mind is a federation. We have about 122 local minds and about 900 trustees. And you can believe it or not, but we actually don't have a central database for trustees. So it's quite difficult to tap somebody on the shoulder or find somebody even on our intranet to start a conversation. So I was lucky enough that National Mind allowed me to become the force engine, the person behind the trustee community. So over the last 2 years at an annual conference for mine staff, volunteers and trustees, we've been trying to get as many trustees engaged to talk about what we have in common and what our challenges are and how we can tackle them going forward, because the strength is in numbers. So we do have a lot of brain power on our boards. It's about how best we can harness that. So if you're part of a smaller charity, maybe have a look whether there are other trustees and other charities around that you could perhaps build your own community and start sharing your experience. With regards to my second charity that I'm really proud of is they have been reaching out to beneficiaries. They have built already an advisory board. So there's a lot of lived experience, knowledge sharing that comes from a group of our beneficiaries. And this is something I think that a lot of boards should be thinking of in the future, really giving the beneficiaries the voice, not through just surveys, but through face-to-face meetings, through active influence and participation. If I could have the next slide, please. So going forward, please be a change agent. You probably are committed to deliver or have at least 40 to 50 hours a year as a trustee. If you miss one board meeting, if you have those 10 extra hours a year, please do your research, start thinking about what other knowledge gaps your board may need to address, and do a bit of change management. So that's a call to action I would like to leave you with. Thank you.
For us all. I wonder whether I can ask you a bit about how those areas that you've just been talking about in terms of becoming a more progressive board have helped the boards that you are on in responding to the pandemic and also the cost of living crisis. How do you think that that has made your board more effective in that crisis response?
We definitely had a few more of those aha moments. So one of the questions was about the CEO report template. We discovered it was 10 years old, and that people were a bit shy about pointing it out. But as soon as I was brave enough to say, I'm a new person here, how do we know that this is still the right way to provide information about our operations and our successes and challenges? We realized that we could align the CEO report more to what strategy plan is and how we progress against it. Yeah, and also as somebody who is a beneficiary or former beneficiary, I think it's also important to talk about impact. So half of our board came to NPC's workshop when you were talking about impact reporting and how to measure impact. So we have taken it on board, and we have a task and finish group to talk about how to implement it at the Richmond Borough Mine. Because I do think the board needs to evaluate how we are delivering for the beneficiaries, not whether we deliver something. We really need to understand whether it's of a good enough quality.
Mm-hmm. Well, delighted to hear that you all came along. That's great news. And is it fair to say then, from what you've said, that you see an effective board in times of crisis as being quite similar to an effective board at other times, that once you have those things in place, it helps you in responding to crises as well as in business as usual?
I think we have to be more self-reflective now. So we need to be asking questions. Are we doing good enough job? Can we do better? Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Monica. We're going to move on to Q&A now with all of the panelists. So I will invite Nigel and Adebayo to come back and join us in the virtual room. And I can see that there are already a few questions that have started to come in on the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. If you have other questions that have occurred to you as the speakers have been talking, please do add them in, and we will leave that open for you to carry on asking questions as they occur to you. So to kick us off, Nigel, I can see that you have already answered a question in the chat that has come from Elizabeth Davies at the Prison Education Trust, who was asking about whether it's legitimate to build up reserves to do the right thing by staff in a time of crisis. So I imagine, Elizabeth, you're thinking there of the needs of staff as well as beneficiaries when the going gets tough through the cost of living crisis. Nigel, you had written an answer there already, but it looks like you wanted to expand on it. So why don't we kick off there?
Yeah, I think it's one. It's a very good question. You know, what as an employer, a charity clearly has responsibility for its staff. That goes beyond. That's clear. I think that clearly the challenge is there are different stakeholders that the charity needs to manage, but primarily it's about the beneficiaries. And the only reason you're actually employing staff is to serve the beneficiaries. Now, if you're in a situation where by not supporting the staff, you're actually going to the service is going to deteriorate, and you're not going to be able to provide the service, then you clearly need to do something with your staff. But what you do with the staff needs to be in order to. It must be in order to, and I think I'll just reflect on something I saw right at the beginning of lockdown. It was from a major national charity, and they had shut down all their online shopping at the beginning of COVID, including food shopping. They'd shut it down, and at the time I just couldn't quite understand why they'd done this. And the post, that may have been the right decision. I don't know enough about it to know whether it was the right decision or the wrong decision. But what they put up on their website to justify this was they said, our first priority is the safety of our staff. And I went, hang on a minute, your first priority is to your beneficiaries. Yes, you need to be, you know, and I thought, what would have happened if the hospital managers had taken that attitude? Mm. Nurses wouldn't have gone to work. I said, come on. So I think we need to, it's a multiplicity of stakeholders. It's not clearly an easy decision. That's what I mean. It's management, it's leadership decisions. There is a trade-off. It may be that you need fewer staff in order to actually provide a better service. That may be a trade-off that you have to play. But whatever decisions you make on staff, always remember that the only reason the chief exec's got a job and the finance director's got a job is to provide service to those beneficiaries.
Fantastic. So once again, the needs of beneficiaries being the guiding star for all decision making, but not at the exclusion of other considerations as well.
Yeah,
so
and I think you know, there are other ways. Sometimes we need to be a little bit more creative and innovative in the way we start to solve problems. So you know, and I think one of the particular issues with that comes across the charity sector for me is the propensity of charities to try and do it on their own, rather than collaborate or merge, or you know, with other charities. Say we're trying to achieve the same thing. Why there's more than one of us trying to do the same thing in the same area, and maybe we could actually work together and get a win-win.
Yes, that's an interesting point, Nigel, as to whether people will start thinking a bit more about potential mergers or collaboration of other types as we go more into the cost of living crisis. There are a few questions that have come up reflecting on the points, Monica, that you were starting to make at the end around trustee development. So there's a question about whether there's a good trustee development programme template that boards can use to help support new trustees or people who might be prospective trustees. And There's also a question around collective experience of any challenges around involving people with lived experience. So I'll take those questions together. Does anyone want to come in on those?
So maybe I'll comment on the template, or at least point you in the direction of trustee development. There's a lot of really useful information on the NCVO's website. One of the ideas that I'm going to be doing or implementing with my board is we have a skills matrix, a document, but we want to have the skills audit. So we want to all sit down and have a look at the gaps and potential opportunities for us to upskill. I know it's not the best perhaps terms to be used because we're all volunteers, but some people may have a natural interest in certain areas. I don't know, risk management may be something very exciting for a few of our trustees, and for some it might be safeguarding. So NCVO would be a really good place to start.
Of any challenges in having more people with lived experience on your boards? Has anyone found on the boards that they're on that there have been any challenges, and if so, how have you responded to those? Sounds like maybe there haven't been any challenges from people's expressions. Nigel, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I thought Adebayo was going to say, I thought you were going to answer then. The challenge, well, one of the challenges is clearly managing conflict of interest. In the same way that you know, if you look at the Board of School Governors, if you've got probably got parents on that Board of Governors who've got children at the school, you need to be making decisions in the best interest of all those children, not just your own. And I think so we need the voice of the beneficiary, but we need it to shape our decision making for all the beneficiaries, not just one. And I certainly have been in a situation where there's somebody on the Board of Trustees who was focused basically too heavily on their own personal you know, their particular child. Difficult, isn't it? You want people with a passion there, and the passion comes from for it being real, but it needs to be put into, and I think this is the particular role of charity trustees, which I think is particularly difficult, to take that in and manage the expectations in order to make what can be a difficult decision, which will almost certainly involve some form of compromise.
I think we might have lost him there. We'll hold that thought in case he makes it back onto the webinar.
I think it's really important for the board to talk about lived experience and define what lived experience means really for your charity. That is probably the first task, and just go from there.
Fantastic. I won't touch too much on lived experience because we actually have another webinar coming up in our series, which we'll talk about that specifically. So if anyone is particularly interested in discussing this topic more, then do sign up for our next webinar, and we'll share details of that in the chat later so that you have those to hand. Adebayo has made it back, which is fantastic. There's also a question in the Q&A around how trustees can change pace when there's a crisis. So we've talked quite a bit about kind of the principles around decision making, how you ensure that your board is in a good place to respond to a crisis even before it hits. But what about when the crisis does hit? How do you actually navigate that change of pace? Adebayo, I wonder if I can come to you on that one.
Yeah, I think you've just nailed it on the head. That is preparation before then. In my presentation, I did talk about that we all know that change is inevitable, but and it's even more challenging in terms of crisis. So he's always been ready for it, and having that framework, I mean, in which you ensure that you're resilient and open board, to change, and your willingness to actually change, to it. So I mean, Nigel did say that, if you're on the board of trustee, if you're not ready to make decisions, then why are you there? So which means you're always ready for it, and there's some crisis that, I mean, like the pandemic, it's unprecedented. We didn't so it's it's your perspective and your mindset, in willing to stand up to the challenge instead of cowering back from the challenge, and with that comes creativity, and it comes, and an opportunity to respond, swiftly as well. So I think that's the key thing. Any board of trustee is always open to it, to know that, well, I'm here. I know there's always going to be changes, and there's going to be challenge, crisis. This one is not going to be the last one, so we need to know it. I know you did mention it at the start, that is, so do we think that it's not the end of crisis now? Is that now become the norm? So I think part of the preparedness of trustees to also, be willing to be prepared for crisis as well.
Comes to mind from what you've said is, how do you make sure that in your response, in that creativity, that you are listening sufficiently to the views of the people that you are supporting, to make sure that you are reflecting what they're telling you in your response? That can be particularly hard when you're trying to act quickly. So I wonder whether you've got any reflections from QVT about how you managed to do that through your COVID response.
I think for us at that time, it was a time of uncertainty. So we ensure that where we had a key person that is like a go-to in terms of how we regularly communicate. So there must be that regular communication with people, and ensuring that we're listening and we're reviewing and reflecting on what and there's also feedback to people as well, to our beneficiaries, on whatever decision is being made, and ensure that is within the framework. Because I mean, whatever decision you're going to make, like the crisis for the COVID, for instance, we can't work in silo. We work with different other organizations, regulators, the government. So that makes it all holistic in terms of our response, and the information we're feeding back to the beneficiaries as well, that, we're all in this together. This is, and ensuring that communication is key, in terms of information, giving it to people and making them aware that, well, this is the guideline, and it's not something that we're all in it together, and by communicating together, we can go through it together.
Can't be
Yes.
sidelined in the pace to respond. Yeah.
That's right.
Nigel, did you want to come in on that? I think you're unmuted.
Just a couple of things. Firstly, just going back to the trustee development, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Getting on Board has a whole host of webinars available. They're free to air, so go to the website, you'll see where they are, and they address many of the aspects of that will be incorporated within that trustee development. So that's soapbox over. I think you're mentioning that kind of difference between managing a crisis and managing a business as usual. I think one of the things, one of the ways I've phrased it was during, and let's go back to the COVID one because that's the biggest one. During COVID, we actually had a common enemy. Everybody around the board was united. We know what everybody had a common enemy, and actually that period of that ended up being a major challenge, but also a really strong time for innovation and create a new thinking. And I think the role in that was to ask the questions: well, is there a better way? You know, is this really the only way? What else could we do? And challenge those assumptions that have governed the way we've worked for some time. And while with those charities that do have a paid staff and a chief exec or a charity director, and then saying, you know, how can we help in this time? So as a board of trustees, we did meet more frequently with the staff, and we did get more involved, but we did it as a team. Interestingly, I think one of the challenge, and you see this in broader society as well, when there is this common enemy, people come together. When that common enemy disappears, you know, the war is won. Then the breaks start to appear again, and actually, I've personally found keeping the team together after COVID has been more difficult than it was during, because you don't have that single point of focus, and you see in the political environment when you know, with countries kind of splitting and the factions coming out, and actually what. It's a different style of leadership that's required, and it may be that actually there's a change of personnel is needed in order to then take it on to another level. So I'm actually stepping down from my chair's role in the next few months. That's one of the reasons, because actually there's a different phase here. It's a different stuff that somebody else take it on. Yes.
So knowing the right time to allow other people to take on those roles is important.
Oh yes. Just because, you know, you can stay for a maximum of 6 years does not mean you have to stay for a full.
Yeah. I see Jane's question in the chat as well, which I think is quite relevant to what you were just talking about, Nigel. Talking about the topic of spending reserves in a difficult time, and the reserves policy at her organisation being cautious. And some trustees disagreeing on that. Do you have any experience of navigating that kind of disagreement? What would your suggestions be?
All the time. This is the, you know, are we playing it safe, or are we making decisions? So, well, let me give you an example. When we went into, we were lucky enough to have built up 5 or 6 months reserves in the charity, and that had come from 6 weeks reserves 2 years before. So it was quite. And we, you know, I remember we sat down in the board meeting, and I said, look, we've got these 6 months reserves, and the only reason we've built up these reserves is for a crisis. And can anybody, you know, is there a crisis going on? You know, rhetorical question. So we have to be prepared to spend at least some of these reserves. And I see articles just in the last week about, oh, shock horror, charities dipping into the reserves. You know, why have you got them if you're not going to dip into them? And we said, okay, and we said we are going to invest in this. If it happens that this charity disappears within a year, then that's, you know, that's a real shame. But we'll you know, something else will happen. What actually happened is we started to spend the money. We set up online sessions. We completely changed our delivery mode, and we started to tell 1 or 2 people what we were doing. And I remember one in particular. We had a conversation on a Thursday afternoon with a potential funder, and just said what we were doing. We didn't even put a bid in. Monday morning, we had a check in the post. So we're so impressed by what you're doing, and actually investing in your beneficiary, investing in the future. Here's some money. We actually ended up 6 months later having doubled our income. But where did that come from? Well, it came from actually being brave and saying, look, we're going to invest this. We're not going to just spend it willy-nilly, but we're going to invest it. What else can we be doing? And I've you know, and the counter was again a major national charity with financial reserves of I think I'm right in saying it's about 2.5 years, about $1 billion, and they furloughed 80% of their staff and shut down everything. And it was, you know, come on. We can't just look at reserves as something that has to be protected, and we can't give those decisions to the people who are focused primarily on control and compliance. It's essential, but it's not sufficient. We have to be prepared to take risks, be brave, and actually look to change and grow a charity, and that means spending something.
Yeah. Thank you. Not easy discussions to have on a board where people have very differing views, but hopefully that's helpful, Jane, and answers your question. There's also a question here about how boards can make sure that they learn enough from how they responded to a previous crisis so that they can be better prepared for next time. So we've talked a lot about how you can be prepared for next time, but how can you ensure that that learning takes place on a board, and that isn't lost into kind of the historical memory of an organisation? Monica, do you have any thoughts on that from the two boards that you're on?
I think it's really important to have a very frequent board effectiveness conversation, whether it's a formal structured one, so you take half a day or a couple of hours to engage with an external facilitator, or whether one of you on the board is willing enough to facilitate the conversation. You really need to talk about how well you're doing and what you've learned and what you would have done differently. If at all possible, I don't know whether all boards are brave enough to be so self-reflective, but I think going forward, this is really, really important.
Can I ask how regularly you have those conversations on the boards that you're
on? Currently, it's every 2 years, but I think it should really happen informally more often.
Lovely. Adebayo or Nigel, did you have any reflections on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Monica just said. I mean, like on our board as well, we always reflect on the 15 board effectiveness questions, which you reflect on. And in times of crisis, yes, and we also, interestingly, do it every 2 years, looking at those ones. But I possibly going to take you away from here to think that we reflect on doing it even more often, really, especially doing it more regularly when there has been a crisis. That's a good time to reflect, and look at how you learn from it. Like our board, we have yearly board away day, so that's another opportunity for you to reflect, on how we've responded in crisis.
The other trigger that leads to a review of the board is when you bring on new faces. And so if a new trustee joins, give them the freedom to ask the questions about, well, what did you learn? What did we, I think that can often be a very good trigger to driving that learning cycle.
Another call for bringing new faces onto a board. Fantastic. I think we've only got one more question. So as a warning to people in the audience, if you have any questions that haven't been answered, that you haven't written down, then please do pop them in the Q&A, because this will be your last chance to ask the panelists. So there's a question here around your reflections on tackling the organisational and community resilience questions that are raised by climate change. So we've talked about some of the other crises that we're facing at the moment through the cost of living crisis, but not particularly about climate change and how boards can navigate that challenge. In some ways it feels quite different from the cost of living crisis, but also some similarities in terms of the extent to, or I guess, the existential threat to an organisation. Monica, did you want to share some thoughts on that? I can see you're off mute.
Our board has decided to become more digital, so the papers are no longer printed. We decided to be more eco-friendly and invested in using technology. So we have Google Docs, we have other channels to communicate, and this was the first step. The second step is just looking at our ESG policy as well, and see what we could be doing in terms of environment, social and governance as well.
Okay.
Around and I think from a trustee's perspective, a chair's perspective, I just be looking at this and saying, what can we actually control, and what can we influence, and what have we got no control over whatsoever, and just focus on those things that we can actually control. So you mentioned kind of carbon footprint and traveling, and yeah, we can control those. There's other things that we can't control, and this is a huge issue that needs big responses. And yeah, I just I would just avoid getting taken off to the Milky Way and trying to do things over which you have no control whatsoever.
I think the other thing that one possibly should consider as our board of trustees is to be a voice there, within the sector, in bringing, information on these and the awareness of it. And because as a body, you can make more influence, for instance, part of the board member group on the National Housing Federation. So I'm talking about being on part of boards of bigger, wider organization like that, to be a voice in ensuring that the meaningful discussion taking place on how we can effectively make changes, in our society to that.
Fantastic. That seems like a really good place to leave the discussion. Thank you, all three of you, for your time today. It's been really great to hear your insight coming from different organisations and bringing some different perspectives, but actually an awful lot of agreement between the three of you over the importance of putting beneficiaries first and making sure that boards aren't overly risk averse when responding to a crisis. So thank you. I think that has been really helpful. Just a few final things from me before we finish. I just want to thank the Clothworkers Company again for making these seminars possible. The Clothworkers also run the Charity Governance Awards, which you'll have heard Adebayo mention. QVT was shortlisted for last year. The awards are designed to celebrate outstanding governance and trusteeship in charities across the UK, allowing large and small not-for-profit organisations to inspire and learn from one another. They're the only charity awards that are designed to celebrate trustees, so very relevant to this group, and they're free to enter. Entries are already open, so do have a look if you are interested in applying, and I think someone will pop a link in the chat with where you can apply for those if you want to find out more. It's been really great to hear from so many people today, and we hope that you have enjoyed the session. This is the first in our series of seminars for this year. The next one, which I already mentioned, will be on the 9th of February. And that will be about combining lived and professional experience on boards, which is something that we touched on today. And again, you can find the link to sign up for that in the chat. Just one final request from me before we finish. We would really love to hear your feedback about today's session. So there will be a link to a survey in the chat. And it would be really great if you could fill that out so that we can learn how to improve our events for the future and what makes them valuable to you. We're also hoping to have a few short telephone interviews with a handful of people about their experience of the seminars. If that's something that you're happy to take part in, then please do drop us an email on events@thinknpc.org. And again, that link will be in the chat. So that is everything from me today. Thank you so much for coming, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks all.
Thank you.